What is going to happen in Ukraine? What are the potential outcomes, and what is likely to happen in terms of timing and markets in reaction to these outcomes? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about exactly that. First, a shout out to the Financial Times for coming up with the 5 scenarios of what could potentially happen in terms of a resolution in Ukraine and, of course, with Russia. And then I'll be adding details on my perspectives for timeframes and, of course, what the implications might be for markets. So let's get right into these 5 scenarios. The first scenario is a Russian win and Zelensky getting toppled. That is the Zelensky government failing, the Zelensky government collapsing, Zelensky dying or being captured, some form of terrible outcome. Now, this scenario does have a certain likelihood of happening because of Russia's military might, though as long as we keep supplying weapons, as Western allies are, to Ukrainians, it's become very difficult for Russia to actually continue to mount their offensive in a successful manner. They severely underestimated the resolve of Ukrainians and the power of Zelensky. But either way, in this scenario, if Russia were to win, they would likely install a pro-Moscow government, a puppet government. The problem with this is it would likely lead to an insurgency in Ukraine, similar to what we had seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the issue here is Russia would have to occupy. And the problem is, and we've known this from prior research, Russia does not have enough troops to occupy. When we occupied, for example, Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, we invaded with approximately 19 troops per 1,000 civilians. When Germany invaded Poland during World War II, they invaded with approximately 80 soldiers per 1,000 civilians. This is why it was a blitzkrieg. It was an overwhelming amount of soldiers. When you see NATO enter a combat, you also usually see somewhere between 17 to 20 troops per 1,000 civilians. Russia right now is in Ukraine with only 6 soldiers per 1,000 civilians. This is likely to lead to a very prolonged insurgency and a very, very weak Moscow government. This is not, in my opinion, going to work very well. Not only are we going to see a Russian economy continue to falter under the pressure of being kicked out of the SWIFT system before there's really an alternate for it, the SWIFT banking system, we're going to continue to see supply issues as it relates to manufacturing components for, let's say, as even just Russian vehicles. Imagine this, you want to buy a car, but unfortunately 1/3 of parts that go into Russian vehicles come from outside of Russia. Russia is either going to have to source these all from China, potentially sources them from other countries, or likely does as well, or Russia's just not going to be able to produce as many cars. And this is why we've seen 20% inflation in car prices in Russia in just the last 2 weeks. In my opinion, this scenario, that is a pro-Moscow government in Ukraine, is going to continue to be bad for markets. We're going to have a lack of control for wheat, for neon, for palladium. This is going to be bad for oil prices. While I do think the shock pain, that is the 130 to 150 price per barrel, will wane, will likely stay at elevated oil prices for a while, say $90 to $110 per barrel. So we'll see some reprieve here, but we'll likely see more of the same in that big uncertainties will be gone. The uncertainty of a war with NATO and a nuclear battle might be gone, which is very, very good. We don't want to go in that direction, which is one of the scenarios we'll talk about. So this scenario will be better for markets, but it won't be great because we still won't have a resolution. We'll have a power vacuum in Ukraine while Russia attempts to install their power structure, which Ukrainians are unlikely to respect. Again, leading to prolonged insurgency, a lot of death, and a lot of continued destruction. Now, this will, of course, be a very localized issue, but it doesn't matter if wheat fields burn down in Ukraine and 30% of the world's wheat comes from the Ukraine-Russia region. Wheat prices are going up. Baguettes in France are going to be more expensive, and inflation will continue to reign havoc, or reap havoc, whatever, create havoc throughout the world, unfortunately. So this is not one of the best case scenarios, though it is definitely not as bad as a full-on war with NATO. That would be the absolute worst case scenario. So little reprieve, but probably more of the same in this scenario. Now, another option would be a little bit of mix here, a partial Russian victory, where basically Zelensky's government goes bankrupt Maybe they end up retreating to Western Ukraine. Let's say they make Lviv the capital, which, given that Russia right now has been mostly focused, at least as the Financial Times puts it, they've mostly focused their assault on the Eastern Front, in addition to Kyiv and Odessa in the south. They've mostly focused their bombardment, like Mariupol and Kharkiv, over on the Eastern Front. Maybe this is an indication that Russia is okay with a partitioned Ukraine, where essentially you draw a line down the middle. Russia potentially ends up taking Odessa, the seaport, third largest city, and Kyiv, the capital, as well as eastern territories. But Ukraine exists as sort of now a 40% of what it used to be country, with a capital in Lviv, where we've really had almost no assaults on Western territories. Now, one argument is that that's what Russia is trying to carve out. Another argument is Russia's coming from the north, the south, and the east, and they just haven't made it all the way to the west side yet. Who knows? But Putin has hinted at a partitioned Ukraine. So this does mean there is some likelihood that this could potentially happen. Now, in this case, we might end up seeing less of an insurgency because Ukrainians who are still remaining in Ukraine could potentially, no guarantees here, choose to move to Western Ukraine. The problem with that is that means giving up their land, their property, their belongings, their cities, their businesses in Eastern Ukraine or central to Eastern Ukraine. Now, that could be likely, though, because a lot of that property could be destroyed or just under Russian control, which creates very difficult opportunities to reestablish normal life in sort of the Eastern Bloc. It's almost kind of like we might sort of see the division that we saw in Germany, West Germany versus an East Germany, although I doubt there would be a wall unless Russia pays for it. Now, another option. Well, I suppose I should briefly mention economically. Economically, this scenario here is probably better than a complete Russian win because there is a potential that some of this will be seen as somewhat negotiated. And if Ukraine says, you know what, we're good with this, we're good, which is unlikely at this point, but it's possible. If we're good with this, go ahead, lift some of the pain on Russia. Ultimately, that's going to come down to negotiations between Ukraine and the Western world. And maybe we could see some sanctions lifted. We could actually see likelihood of more relaxation in markets than in scenario number one. Remember, scenario number one is no more Ukraine. Like, Russia completely takes it. Scenario number two is partitioned. I would say scenario number two is significantly better for markets than scenario number one. Of course, this is still a bad scenario for Ukraine. It's giving up a lot of land, a lot of power. But it could be what Putin's going for, because remember, what Putin wants is a demilitarized Ukraine. Now, this is important because as a condition of joining NATO, you actually have to prove that you could provide military support. Here's the criteria in the words of NATO. The criteria, I'll put it up on screen as well. It says, these criteria include a functioning democratic political system based on a market economy, fair treatment of minority populations, a commitment to resolve conflicts peacefully, an ability and willingness to make military contributions to NATO operations, and a commitment to a democratic civil military relationship and institutions as well. So here you can see if Ukraine has no military, then they're unable to make military contributions to NATO, which would actually disqualify them from joining NATO solely from that point. This is one of the reasons that Putin wants to see a demilitarized Ukraine, and this is why it's likely that Putin's not going to give up his fight for the capital, Kyiv. And again, this is where you could potentially see a new capital move westward in this scenario. But again, we'll also have insurgency in the east, so we'll still have anxieties in the east. Okay, now, scenario number three. This is probably the best case scenario, and this is a negotiated solution. So Bloomberg this morning has been talking about the constant airing of, quote, continuous talks with Russia over video and Zoom calls. This is very good. The more talks we have, the better. The prior three discussions so far have focused predominantly on ceasefire negotiations and humanitarian corridors, which have really collapsed every time, even under the management of the Red Cross, mostly because Russian troops or Ukrainian troops, somebody ends up firing either through mistrust or fear or lack of communication or whatever, and the corridors fall apart. Now, of course, you do have some levels of escalation here. For example, You have Sergei Lavrov suggesting that the U.S. is providing biological weapons to Ukraine, and at the same time, you have Joe Biden saying any use of chemical weapons will be met with a, quote, severe price. Now, if Obama before Biden is any clue here, then Putin probably doesn't care about Biden's words, because remember, Obama said if chemical weapons were used and during his term in the Middle East, then that would be a red line. Remember Syria, Damascus, and the use of potentially mustard gas, which ultimately came out to be, mustard gas was used. Well, Obama's red line was crossed and nothing happened. This is, of course, one of the stains on Obama's presidency, and I don't mean to just only say that as if I'm anti-Obama or for Obama. It's just an observation. This is I'm picking one of the downsides, but only because it relates to what Biden is saying here. This is not a video about Obama. Anyway, obviously, we know that Kyiv so far is ready for a diplomatic solution. We have heard from Zelensky that he is interested in talking to Putin directly and believes by talking to Putin directly he could end this war. We have heard Zelensky say that he is no longer interested in joining NATO, probably would extend that to not wanting to join the EU as well. And so with a negotiated solution here, it is possible that Ukrainians would say, look, we've negotiated a solution. Let's loosen some of the sanctions. Let's get Russia back into SWIFT. Now we can potentially reduce the odds of a Great Depression in Russia, since the Russian economy is getting absolutely destroyed. So obviously is the Ukrainian economy, and the global economy is suffering. Global GDP is suffering here. But this negotiated end would probably be the best case scenario for markets. I would expect if oil starts flowing again, Russian oil starts flowing again, we could see a reduction in inflationary fears. The new sort of transitory type of inflation would prove to be true. And we would see a relaxation in markets and probably a broader rally. So best case scenario for markets here would be a negotiated solution, despite the fact that there continue to be aggressions on both sides. For example, there's a report that apparently from Ukrainian airspace fighter jets launched missiles onto a Belarusian town, and it appears to be that the goal of this is trying to essentially aggro, using a video gaming term here, the Belarusian military into combat in Ukraine to fight alongside the Russians against Ukrainians, because now the Belarusians are being dragged into this war, which they've previously suggested they might consider moving into Ukraine with Russia. So who knows? Maybe is that something that's going to tip them over the edge? Nobody knows. Okay, now the next scenario, this is scenario number 4, is that Putin ends up getting defeated somehow. So Putin could get defeated in a few different ways. So first of all, if allies continue to provide weapons, Stinger missiles, javelins, you name it, it's possible that Russian troops could end up getting repelled long enough for elites in the Kremlin to essentially overthrow Putin. You could have a military coup. So elites in the Kremlin, this would be like the politicians, the oligarchs saying, Putin, you got to go. Let's get you an island. Let's get you a Napoleon Bonaparte kind of style home, and let's get you out of here, okay? You got to go retire, and disappear. Okay, that would be an elite kind of style takeover, right? And then a relaxation, hopefully. The Russian military could potentially take over out of frustration over the disastrous casualties and failures in Ukraine, especially if a lot of them felt lied to about them just going to Ukraine or the border for military exercises, and now they're on the front lines of a special military operation, aka war. Russian military could end up overthrowing Putin. This would be a military coup, a coup d'etat, and this would be replacing the Kremlin's government with a military power. Now, likely the only reason this would happen is if the military wanted to withdraw from Ukraine and end the war. Otherwise, they would just keep going on the same side as Putin. So that would be good news as well. Obviously, there's this potential of the citizens revolting, but it's a lot harder for the citizens to revolt when the state controls the media. So this might be a little bit more difficult or more challenging as a method of overthrowing Putin. But either way, Putin could also, happen to drink nuclear tea, as Kevin O'Leary suggests from Shark Tank, or, somehow end up disappearing. This is probably going to be a second best case scenario here, negotiated solution being the best, because then we would be certain of the outcomes. The second best case scenario is if Putin, for whatever reason, was overthrown or disappeared. Then the reason this would be likely a best case scenario, because likely whoever's overthrowing Putin doesn't agree with Putin's war and then wants to end the war. But we're not as certain as that as a potential negotiated solution, right? Now you also, if you do have a Putin government collapsing, and let's say Russia becomes almost somewhat of a demoted state. I don't want to say failed state, but they would certainly lose a lot of power. It's possible that you would create a power vacuum in Russia. And if there's a power vacuum in Russia, it wouldn't actually surprise me to see Western allies and NATO try to actually move towards Russia to try to establish aid in Russia. That could be humanitarian aid because of the depression, banking aid, food aid, whatever aid in the western regions of Russia. And it's also possible that at the same time, because there's no way China's going to allow Western nations getting into Russia, it's also possible that you could see Chinese influence coming in on the eastern side of Russia to sort of aid and rebuild the Russian economy. Obviously, this would also include a lot of aid in rebuilding efforts in Ukraine, but also considering the Russian economy has been devastated, there'll likely be some form of power struggle in Russia, and this would lead to a lot of uncertainty in Russia. This obviously, again, assumes that Ukraine gets a lot of help. The Ukrainian government's going to have to get rebuilt, right? But Zelensky would likely rebuild Ukraine because in this case scenario, Russia lost, right? So Zelensky would likely rebuild Ukraine with the help of Western nations and Western allies, and then you'd have some interesting power dynamics in Russia. Remember, the goal generally of countries is to create or become regional hegemons. So a regional hegemon is basically a power that ends up having cultural, political, military, and economic might in a region. Okay, next. This is the absolute worst case scenario. This is scenario number 5. Scenario number 5, terrible scenario. This would be a war with NATO. That is, this war in Ukraine spills over to Poland or another NATO country, Latvia, whatever. And we end up dragging the European Union, the United States, NATO into a disaster with Russia. This could potentially have nuclear implications. This is I would say the least likely scenario, but it is one that is creating a lot of fear. So any other scenario that eliminates the potential for a war with NATO, would be very positive, I believe, for markets, removing that sort of nuclear threat from markets. So these are the 5 scenarios here, and I gotta again shout out the Financial Times here for the inspiration on this. Of course, I've added a lot of information and research and content to this, but I want to ask you, what do you think? What is the most likely scenario? Remember, we've got five scenarios here, and so maybe in the comments down below, let me know. Scenario number 1: Russia wins, Zelensky's toppled. Number 2: partial Russian victory, and the Zelensky government goes bankrupt. Number 3: negotiated end, no overall control. Putin toppled is number 4 with a Russian retreat. That's number 4. And then a war with NATO, number 5. What scenario do you think is likely, or maybe what odds of each would you say? Personally, if I had to pick, I would say the odds of a negotiated end are probably the highest likely shot here. I'd say this is probably about a 60% chance of happening. I think a war with NATO is probably in the direction of 2%. So very, very low. Let's see, that leaves me about 38% to give up. The next scenario, I would say, would probably be about 20% for a partial Russian victory and Zelensky moving westward. That brings us to about 82%. So now we've got about 18% left. I would say probably the next maybe 14% would be a Russian win and Zelensky getting toppled, and the leftover 4% there being Putin getting overthrown. So you can see, I think the NATO war chance is around 2%. Putin getting toppled around 4%. Very, very low chance there. Negotiated end, or sort of that east-west Ukraine, in my opinion, probably most likely. Of course, the negotiated end being the best case scenario for markets, which I believe is the most likely. I just hope and pray that this happens sooner rather than later to help prevent and limit the loss of civilian lives and just lives in general. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, consider sharing the video, and folks, we'll see you in the next one. Bye.